Hello everyone and welcome to Random Act of Squirrel. I hope you enjoyed the open. It's partially finished at this point in time. I got the visual and I can't visualize the sound yet. So there's no sound yet, but if you see comments and stuff, I'd like to see some comments on if you liked it or not as far as how it looked and things like that. When I tested a couple people at work and showed them it, they smiled, which was my goal. So at this point, I'm trying to figure out what's going to sound well underneath it, and then I'll have something that looks really pretty that way. Today is Act 19. It is Acts of Novel Formations. It is Whys and Suffering. Victor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. This is a heavy one, so if you check out on this one a little bit more, I'm going to try to keep it light, and if you do follow through on some of the heavy stuff right away, I don't want to guarantee there's a silver lining, but there's a really cool moment that I like about this stuff. Kind of like the book, so if you get the heavy stuff, then I think it's going to be worth it. I've been kind of wanting to do this book anyways, just because it's one of those books that if you read like a top 10 list book of something that everyone references that wants to sound smart but nobody's read, this is one of those books. Interestingly enough, it's really not that big. This is the 2006 edition. It's got a couple pieces added to it. It's really not that long of a book. It's only 164 pages. So like if you remember from Louder from Hell, which is, I don't remember which video, you'd have to look back, I apologize. That's like almost 700 pages. So it's not a thick book. It's just everything in it is pretty heavy. For those that are not aware of it, well, let's walk through. I'll give you kind of a rundown, and then a little bit later why, you know what, actually do that first. Life is weird around work right now, and there's a lot of people are just chewing on why things are happening and what's going on and what does it mean. And lately I've just been surrounded by a lot of people that were really wondering, essentially the crux of the book, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of life? What is the reason that we're going through this stuff? And Victor Frankl created something from serving, and he ended up actually being in a Nazi concentration camp. And then eventually he created something called logotherapy, which we'll address more in a little bit. And basically he discovered that most people can withstand most things if they have a strong enough why. And that's the thing I kind of noticed looking around what's happening. Because at work it's getting kind of nutty right now. And Digital Girl's doing some changes. You're watching her adjust. And I'm adjusting to it, and I'm discovering that when my why is clear, and I know why I'm doing what I need to do, everything flows better. And when I don't know why I'm doing it, or it feels fruitless or pointless, then I really don't want to do it. Part of the weird thing, like, I hope it didn't come off too much that way, is when I started uploading all those videos while I was on the trip, I like doing things on passion, and so setting up something ahead of time, I didn't know where my passion would be that day, so it's like I feel like I'm projecting ahead and hoping it matches. Whereas a lot of the stuff when I film, even though I filmed yesterday, this really struck me, and I was talking with someone at work, and she was going through changes at work and positions and things like that, and you could tell she's really chewing on it, and it really kind of struck me deep in my soul, I guess. And that's what makes this book so powerful. I have the 2006 edition. It was originally written in 1946. It was written in, I think it's either German or Austrian. There is essentially 3 parts to the book. Is that the page you want to go with? No, here we go. We're going to start here, I guess. But we can go there first. There's 3 parts to the book. The first part is surviving the concentration camp. The second part, which got added in 1962, is talking about what he took out of it and what he was using as a teaching guide for the therapy and psychology part of the stuff, which was called logotherapy in a nutshell. And then this edition has something that he took out of his classroom called Postscript, which was done in 1984. The book itself, like I said, it's not even 200 pages. So when I picked it up, I thought it would be a pretty easy read. Victor Frankl was an Austrian Jew he was in a Nazi concentration camp, and the first book, as I mentioned, was released in 1946. In 1997, upon his death, he actually had sold 10 million copies in 24 languages. In 2022, he has 16 million copies in over 52 languages. It's kind of crazy. So he was a psychiatrist before World War II and before he got in the concentration camp. And then being in there, basically he got stuck with the lab rats. And so he started discovering like what drove people's will to live, what caused some people to survive and other people to wither away and die right away. And it surprised him because the strongest people you thought often didn't survive. And whereas a lot of times these really weak, sickly ones, they would survive through the whole thing. And so he got very curious in a way that only a psychiatrist would get curious. And then he started processing a lot of it. And that's where he came up with the logotherapy, the therapeutic method that he created called logotherapy. And that's the big part I find more interesting to the book. It's broken into two parts. The first part, or about first half, give or take, is him talking about his experiences being captured, being in the actual Nazi concentration camps, what it was like not having shoes, working barefoot on roads in below zero weather, not having food, trying to keep humanity in an inhumane world. And I have felt kind of bad reading it initially because what I would do is I would read while I was eating. And I had a hard time reading about people in concentration camps basically drinking watered down broth water while I'm enjoying my meal. So that kind of ended up stopping. Normally when I read, I can go through about, like in an hour, I would say about 40 pages an hour. I tend to read and think and process. I barely got through about 20 with this thing because the first part was so dense and so emotional that I ended up rereading a couple things, or I would just stop and process, or be like, after about 15 pages, like, that is a lot, I need to stop, I can't handle that much more. What happened to them, it's just unbelievable to think about. And it's kind of shocking that people will do that. But I guess, I'm not trying to belittle hardship, but if you study history long enough, you discover that people can be buttheads. And people, when they think they can get away with it, become bigger buttheads. And I'm glad that there's enough people in the world who are trying to correct what the buttheads do in the world. The second half I like in the book because it's taking essentially the mulch and the horrible things, and he processes out of it, and he creates the concept logotherapy. And I like logotherapy because logo is based off the Greek word logos, which is logic and will, and it's logic more, but it's a deeper term going more into like the will to drive, to live, to strive, that kind of thing. And what he did was innovative because instead of doing more of the classic thing of assuming that when there's a problem, it's always internally driven, which this is, hopefully doesn't bore too long. I promise not to go too deep down some of these rabbit holes. Some of the previous thoughts with like Carl Jung and that kind of stuff, which he talks about in here, was that all this stuff was kind of internally driven. And even Freud, that kind of stuff, so much of the stuff was talking about being internally driven. And his point was some of this stuff is internally driven, but we also live in a world that constantly affects us. And how those stresses affect us, affect our psyche, affect our well-being, that kind of stuff. So let's see here. The second half was probably as hard to read, which you'd think, wait, there's like no starving people and no large groups of people being put in mass graves. And nope, they just use really big psychiatry terms. And so if you can't follow along, you're left where the first part is very emotionally heavy, the second half is very intellectually heavy. What he talks about, though, is the concept being neurogenic or psychogenic neuroses. Neuroses being, well, I don't know, probably ever since Woody Allen and I don't know, all these other ads I'm seeing on TV, everyone's very concept of neuroses. When our brain goes haywire, is it being caused by neurogenic sources, which is outside sources, or psychogenic, which is more internal sources, is this stuff that's being driven by how our brain is wired. So it comes down to how we're affected by how we're perceiving things. He goes through and points out a lot of our problems that we have, we just address wrong. And that's part of his logotherapy that he talks about. And it's why he gets quoted all the time. He gets quoted a lot by saying, if you have a strong enough why, you'll withstand any how, basically, any suffering. And suffering's another part he talks a lot about, that life is hard. Where do we go here? That's the logotherapy page. He cites Nietzsche, so you know it's got to be positive, right? Am I going to find my Nietzsche? Oh, here's the Nietzsche. There's much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And so what he noticed was while he was in the camps, like if someone had a will, one of his wills is he wanted to release a book. He had a book he had written, sorted in his head, that kind of thing. So he was going to survive the camps so he could release this book, this manuscript that he really wanted to release. He talks a little bit more about stories, and this is the part I think is really useful, and it's what ties into the front part. It's also why I really wanted to share this. This is why the book's repeated so many times. Unfortunately, people don't like this part of the lesson, but I think it's really important. You need to figure out, when things are falling apart, is this something where the world's going on top of you, or is this something internally that you need to straighten that's maybe broken on the inside out versus the outside in? He cited two examples, one talking about uncomfortable situations, the other one being suffering. And these are the two things that I like, and I kind of want to leave most before I leave on the small review of what I like and don't like about the book. There was a guy who was going to a job, and he'd been in therapy for 4 or 5 years, several therapists, and he was always upset. So as he was talking, Mr. Frankl discovered that the guy just hated his job. And so he talked about maybe you should change your job. Maybe all the external forces of forcing yourself to like a job that you don't like, to force a life that you don't like, is causing you undue stress, and it's essentially causing other anxiety and heartbreak. So the guy changed his job, which changed his external stimuli, and that made him happier because he wasn't constantly being bombarded by things that were bringing him down. Another part that I like in this talks about suffering, and that's a huge part that he talks about, is part of life is suffering. And while he talks about in the 60s that's a big deal and was shocking, I think that's even more shocking nowadays. And so here we go. Let me set a clear-cut example. Once an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of a severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What could I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but I instead confronted him with a question. What would happen, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered. Upon which I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, for it was you. You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her from the suffering. To be sure, at a price that now you will have to survive and mourn her. But he said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. Such is the meaning of a sacrifice. I think that's the big thing I noticed with the trauma in life that's going on at work, is people are searching for the meaning. In the last year, with everything going on, digital girl in me and life and all that kind of stuff, I was constantly searching for I was constantly searching for why am I going through this? What is the meaning? And it was amazing how once you discover what the meaning is, it makes it easier. And you kind of process through it. And you realize I can get through today. I'm not finding my pen here. What I like about this book, and I don't know, my life's being difficult over there. My pen disappeared, and I don't want to waste your time with me fumbling around trying to find stuff I should have better organized. So I'll say it this way. What I like about this book is there's a reason they quote it. It's truth. It's honest truth. I read this without being in a class. It's a heavy book. If you can get through it, the lessons are there. What I will say is probably the hardest thing about the book, as I keep repeating, it is a very dense book. The pages are tiny, the words aren't that big, but what he pokes at is pretty big stuff. And so if your head's not in the right place, this is probably not the book for you. And everybody who translates his lessons that he's putting through here are probably the best way to get out of this book. If there ever was like a book on tape or like a lecture on tape about this book, I would highly recommend it for most people. Because if you're not if you're slightly above, not slightly above a casual reader, this will probably be too heavy for you. But underneath the heaviness is a lot of hope. And I think that's the truth to a lot of life. Sometimes in the middle of the clouds, there's those silver linings. And sometimes just merely breathing and knowing that you get to breathe tomorrow is enough for you to keep going to tomorrow so you can find the joy that's going to be there the next day. So that's my heavy thought. That's why I wore the shiny shirt. Hopefully the shiny shirt kind of added some fun to it. If you like what you had there, hit the like button. If you have any comments, if you've actually read the book, that'd be super cool. I'd love to find out if anybody else has actually read it, even if it's in a classroom situation. Go ahead and put some comments on about it. What are some hardships or sufferings that you were able to add meaning to that made the suffering worth it? And also if you like where I'm walking, like the things from dad jokes to heavy stuff like this, think it's kind of interesting, to movie reviews, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a good day, and I hope you can find a good why to make your day a wonderful day. Thank you.